This 1895 photograph carried a mystery that baffled historians for generations. Until now, the Charleston auction house smelled of aged paper and distant recollections. Sarah Bennett navigated carefully through rows of dusty crates, her practiced gaze searching for anything deserving preservation. As a scholar of post-Civil War America, she understood that the most profound narratives often lay concealed in the most unexpected corners. It was nearly closing hour when she stumbled upon it, a modest wooden frame tucked beneath a heap of Victorian-era periodicals. The image within halted her completely. The scene depicted a wedding from 1895, evident from the attire and photographic techniques. A white man posed rigidly in a formal black suit, his palm resting upon an ornate chair. Beside him, a black woman wore an elaborate white bridal gown, with intricate lacework that must have commanded a small fortune. Yet what made Sarah's breath catch was the veil. It didn't merely frame the bride's countenance. It shrouded it entirely, draping downward like a white curtain, obscuring every feature. Sarah's hands quivered faintly as she lifted the frame closer to the light. In 1895, interracial unions were unlawful in South Carolina and virtually every other state. The very existence of this photograph defied plausibility. She scrutinized every nuance with mounting intrigue. The bride's bearing was stiff, almost defensive. Her right hand, visible beneath the veil's hem, was clenched into a tight fist. The groom fixed his gaze directly at the camera with an unreadable expression. Was it defiance, pride, or terror? The backdrop was deliberately sparse, merely a painted scenic canvas. No relatives, no attendees. No festive gathering, just two individuals standing before a lens, documenting something that could have shattered both their existences. Sarah carefully turned the frame over. On the reverse, inscribed in faded ink, were only two words: Providence Church. Her thoughts raced. Providence Church. She recognized that name. It had served as a stop on the Underground Railroad, a gathering place for abolitionists even after the Civil War concluded. Yet this photograph was captured 3 decades after emancipation. Why would a couple need to conceal themselves in 1895? She acquired the photograph instantly, barely registering the cost. As she stepped out into the humid Charleston evening, clutching the frame against her chest, Sarah couldn't shake the sensation that she held something far more momentous than a mere wedding portrait. Somewhere within this image lay a narrative deliberately obscured for over a century. A woman whose countenance had been hidden for reasons Sarah couldn't yet fathom. A union that defied the statutes of an entire nation. And Sarah was resolved to unearth every secret this photograph contained. Sarah spread the photograph across her university research desk, positioning 3 intense lamps around it. Through her magnifying lens, details invisible to the naked eye began to materialize. The photograph's quality was remarkable for 1895. The focus sharp, the exposure impeccably balanced. This wasn't the work of an amateur. Whoever captured this moment possessed expertise and access to costly equipment. She examined the bride's gown more closely. The lace pattern was French Alençon, exorbitantly expensive even for affluent households. The dress's cut followed the latest Parisian trends, featuring leg of mutton sleeves and a dramatic train pooling at the bride's feet. This wasn't a modest ceremony. Someone had invested considerable wealth in this wedding. Yet it was the veil that captivated Sarah most. Unlike typical bridal veils of the era, which were sheer enough to see through, this one was crafted from thick white silk that completely obscured the bride's features. It wasn't merely a fashion statement. It was deliberate concealment. Sarah shifted her attention to the groom. His suit was equally costly, custom, tailored with silk lapels. His shoes gleamed with a mirror polish. A gold watch chain draped across his waistcoat. This was a man of affluence, not someone operating in obscurity. Then she noticed something that quickened her pulse. On a small table beside the groom, partially hidden behind the chair, rested a leather-bound book. Sarah adjusted the magnifying glass, straining for more detail. The book's cover bore an emblem. A compass rose intertwined with an olive branch. She had encountered that symbol before. Sarah rushed to her bookshelf and retrieved a volume on secret societies in post-Civil War America. She flipped through pages frantically until she located it. The same insignia belonged to the Brotherhood of Providence, a clandestine coalition of abolitionists, emancipated slaves, and progressive white allies who persisted in their struggle for racial equity long after the war ended. They operated through a network of churches, including Providence Church. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her thoughts spinning. This wasn't merely a forbidden wedding photograph. It was documentation of something organized, something safeguarded by individuals with resources and connections. The veil wasn't shielding the bride from the camera. It was concealing her from anyone who might later view the image, protecting her identity from those who would seek vengeance or reprisal. But why? If the Brotherhood protected this couple, if they possessed wealth and support, why such extreme measures? Sarah examined once more the bride's clenched fist, the tension in her shoulders. She wasn't just a bride on her wedding day. She was a woman in peril. And Sarah was determined to uncover why. The ruins of Providence Church sat on Charleston's outskirts, concealed behind a dense wall of live oaks draped in Spanish moss. Sarah guided her car down an overgrown dirt path, consulting the historical maps she had printed the previous evening. The church had burned in 1923, according to records, but the stone foundation remained. Sarah parked and walked cautiously through the tall grass, her camera bag slung across her shoulder. The foundation outlined a modest structure, perhaps 30 feet in length. Blackened stones marked where flames had consumed the wooden edifice. But beneath an ancient magnolia tree, Sarah discovered what she sought: a small cemetery with weathered headstones. She moved between the graves slowly, photographing each marker, recording names and dates, most dated from the 1860s and 1870s. Freed slaves who had found community here after the war, but one grave made her halt entirely. The headstone read, Reverend Thomas Whitfield, 1848-1899. He married those the law would not. Sarah knelt beside the grave, her hands resting on the warm stone. This was the man who had officiated the ceremony. A white minister willing to break the law, willing to unite couples society deemed illegitimate. She pulled out her phone and called her colleague Marcus, a genealogist specializing in African American history. Marcus, I need assistance locating records for Reverend Thomas Whitfield, Providence Church, Charleston, specifically around 1895. Whitfield. Marcus's voice crackled through the phone. Sarah, that name is legendary in certain circles. He married over 200 interracial couples between 1870 and his death. He was arrested at least a dozen times. The Brotherhood always covered his bail. Sarah's excitement mounted. Did he maintain records? If he did, they'd be concealed. Keeping those records would have been evidence for prosecution. Marcus paused. There's a woman you should speak with. Eleanora Whitfield James. She's Thomas Whitfield's great-great-granddaughter. Lives in Columbia. She's been the family historian for decades. Sarah was already walking back to her car. Can you get me her contact information? I'll text it to you now. But Sarah, be careful with this. Some families don't want these stories unearthed. There's still shame attached, still fear. Sarah glanced back at the ruined church, at the graves of people who had risked everything for love and dignity. I'll be respectful, but this story deserves to be told. As she drove away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was tracing a path deliberately obscured for over a century. Every record destroyed, every name forgotten, every face hidden, all to protect people whose only offense was loving across the color line. Yet someone had wanted this photograph to endure. They had concealed the bride's face but preserved the image itself. They had left clues: the symbol, the church name, the photograph's quality, as if anticipating that someday someone would seek the truth. Sarah was that someone, and she was only beginning. Eleanora Whitfield James resided in a historic home in Columbia's Waverly neighborhood. At 78, she moved with deliberate poise, her silver hair swept back in an elegant bun. She welcomed Sarah into a living room-lined floor, to ceiling with bookshelves. "Marcus informed me you found one of my great-grandfather's photographs," Eleanora said, settling into a worn leather chair. "May I see it?" Sarah carefully removed the frame from her bag and placed it in Eleanora's hands. The older woman's expression shifted instantly, her eyes widening, her breath catching. "Oh, my lord," Eleanora whispered. "I never thought I'd see this one." "You recognize this photograph?" Sarah leaned forward eagerly. Eleanora nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the frame's edge. "My great-grandfather maintained a secret ledger. It was passed down through our family, hidden away. When I inherited it 15 years ago, I read every entry. This couple, they were the most dangerous wedding he ever performed." She rose carefully and walked to a locked cabinet in the corner. From inside, she retrieved a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it to a marked page and handed it to Sarah. The handwriting was precise, dated September 14, 1895, or "Today I married G.H.R. The most perilous union I have ever blessed. R. is not merely a freed woman. She is the daughter of Senator Morrison's household, raised alongside his own children, educated in secret by his late wife. When Mrs. Morrison died last year, the senator planned to sell R. South to distant relatives, erasing any trace of his wife's defiance of social order. J.H., a Boston merchant with Brotherhood connections, offered marriage and escape, but the senator has powerful friends. If R's identity becomes known, both will hang. I photographed them at J.H.'s insistence. He wants proof of their love, proof that they stood before God as equals. But I concealed R's face completely. The veil protects her. Should this image ever fall into wrong hands, they leave tonight on the Northern Railway. God protect them both. Sarah read the entry 3 times, her heart pounding. The bride wasn't just any black woman. She was someone whose very existence threatened powerful people. "Senator Morrison," Sarah said slowly. "I know that name. He was one of the architects of South Carolina's Jim Crow laws." Eleanora nodded grimly. He spent his entire political career fighting racial equality. But his wife, Elizabeth, had been an abolitionist. She educated the daughter of their cook in secret, taught her to read and write, treated her like family. When Elizabeth died, Morrison wanted to erase all evidence of his wife's betrayal. But this woman escaped, Sarah said, with the Brotherhood's help and a man brave enough to marry her despite the consequences. Eleanora's eyes glistened with emotion. "My great-grandfather performed over 200 illegal marriages, but he said this one kept him awake for years. He feared Morrison's reach would find them." Sarah regarded the photograph with fresh understanding. The bride's clenched fist, the groom's tense posture. They weren't just nervous newlyweds. They were fugitives documenting the most dangerous moment of their lives. "Do you know what happened to them?" Sarah asked quietly. Eleanora closed the journal carefully. "That's where the trail goes cold. My great-grandfather never recorded their full names, never knew where they went, for their protection and his." Sarah stared at the photograph. Somewhere beneath that veil was a woman who had defied one of South Carolina's most powerful men. A woman educated in secret, loved in defiance of the law, married in a ceremony that could have killed everyone involved. Finding her identity would be perilous even now. Sarah spent the next 3 days immersed in the South Carolina State Archives, searching for any trace of Senator Morrison and his household. The more she uncovered, the darker the story became. Senator Charles Morrison had been a prominent figure in post-Reconstruction South Carolina, serving from 1885 until his death in 1904. His political career was built on white supremacy. He had authored legislation segregating schools, restricting black voting rights, and criminalizing interracial marriage with increasingly harsh penalties. But his wife, Elizabeth Morrison, had been different. Sarah found her name in abolitionist society records from before the Civil War. Elizabeth had been born in Massachusetts, daughter of a prominent preacher who had sheltered escaped slaves. When she married Morrison in 1863, a political alliance between families, she brought her convictions south with her. Newspaper society columns from the 1870s and 1880s mentioned Elizabeth Morrison's peculiar household management, her unusual charity toward her servants, and her regrettable progressive sympathies. One particularly vicious editorial from 1889 suggested that Mrs. Morrison failed to understand the natural order of Southern society. Then Sarah found Elizabeth's obituary from April 1894. She had died suddenly at age 52. The funeral had been small and private. Senator Morrison declined any public statement beyond expressing his grief. 3 months after her death, Senator Morrison terminated the employment of his entire household staff, an unusual move that sparked gossip in Charleston's social circles. The servants had been redistributed to various positions throughout the state, according to one newspaper account, with no forwarding information provided. Sarah sat back, the pieces falling into place. Elizabeth dies. Morrison immediately dismantles her household, scattering the people his wife had protected. And somewhere in that household was a young woman Morrison wanted gone completely. The educated daughter his wife had raised in defiance of everything he believed. She searched employment records, census data, anything that might list Morrison's household staff. Finally, in the 1890 census, she found it. Morrison household Charleston, Charles Morrison 44, Elizabeth Morrison 48, household staff Martha 32, cook, Rachel 17, daughter of Martha, domestic servant. Rachel, age 17 in 1890, would have been 22 in 1895, the right age for the bride in the photograph. But census records only gave first names for black household servants. Finding Rachel's full identity would require delving deeper into records most historians avoided. The bills of sale, property records, and legal documents that treated human beings as commodities. Sarah's phone rang. It was Marcus. "I've been digging into the Brotherhood of Providence," he said without preamble. They kept their own records, coded and hidden. "I found a contact with access to their archives, a private collection held by a family in Boston. They're willing to let you see the documents, but you have to go in person. No photographs, no copies." "When can I go?" Sarah asked immediately. "Tomorrow, if you can get there." "But Sarah," Marcus's voice grew serious, "this family protects these records for a reason. The Brotherhood protected people whose descendants are still alive, still living with the consequences of their ancestors' courage. Tread carefully." Sarah looked at the photograph on her desk, at the veiled bride whose identity had been protected for 129 years. "I will. I promise." That night, Sarah booked a flight to Boston. She was close now, she could feel it. Rachel, daughter of Martha, raised by Elizabeth Morrison, educated in secret, married to a mysterious Boston merchant with Brotherhood connections. But questions remained. Why had the Brotherhood considered this wedding so dangerous? What made Rachel such a threat to Senator Morrison? And most importantly, had she survived? The Brotherhood archives were kept in a townhouse in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood, maintained by the descendants of James Hartwell, one of the organization's founding members. His great-great-grandson, David Hartwell, greeted Sarah at the door. "You're the historian Marcus told me about," David said, leading her through elegant hallways lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. "The one looking into the 1895 wedding. You know about it?" Sarah asked, surprised. David nodded as he unlocked a heavy wooden door. "My ancestor performed that wedding. He's the J.H. in Reverend Whitfield's ledger. James Hartwell, Boston merchant, Brotherhood leader, and apparently brave enough to marry a woman whose very existence threatened one of South Carolina's most powerful senators." Sarah's excitement surged. "You're descended from the groom?" "I am." David led her into a climate-controlled room filled with filing cabinets and document boxes. "And I've been waiting years for someone to come asking the right questions about that photograph." He pulled out a leather portfolio and opened it carefully on the table. Inside are letters, all written in the same flowing handwriting. James Hartwell corresponded regularly with the Brotherhood's Southern operatives. David explained he traveled to Charleston 4 times between 1894 and 1895, ostensibly on business. But these letters reveal his true purpose. Sarah read the first letter, dated May 1894. The situation with EM's protégé grows desperate. The senator plans to separate her from her mother and send her to his brother's plantation in Mississippi after EM's death. The girl is educated beyond what any white woman in Charleston has received. She speaks 3 languages, has read extensively, and possesses a mind that should not be wasted in servitude. EM has begged us to help. I'm considering a radical solution." The next letter, from August 1894. "I have met the girl. Her name is Rachel, though EM calls her Catherine. A small dignity in an undignified situation. She is 21, intelligent, and terrified. The senator watches her constantly since his wife's death. He knows what she represents. Proof of his wife's betrayal of Southern values. If she remains, she will be silenced permanently, one way or another." Sarah's hands trembled as she read. This wasn't just about an illegal marriage. This was a rescue operation. The September 1895 letter made everything clear. "I proposed marriage to Catherine Rachel yesterday. Not from romantic love. I am 42. She is 22. But from conviction that she deserves the protection my name and wealth can provide. She accepted, understanding our arrangement. We will marry in secret at Providence Church, then travel north immediately. She will take my name, assume a new identity, and finally live free. The senator must never find her. The Brotherhood will ensure our tracks are covered completely." David watched Sarah's expression as she processed the information. "My great-great-grandfather wasn't in love with her," he said quietly. "He was protecting her, giving her freedom through a marriage that was equal parts legal shield and escape route." "Did it work?" Sarah asked urgently. "Did they make it?" David pulled out another document, a marriage certificate dated September 15, 1895, signed by Reverend Thomas Whitfield. The groom's name was listed as James William Hartwell. The bride's name was listed as Catherine Rachel Hartwell, formerly Catherine Rachel Turner. Turner was her mother Martha's surname. David explained. Elizabeth Morrison had it legally recorded when Rachel was born, ensuring she had a free identity separate from the Morrison household. It was Martha's maiden name, a small act of dignity. Sarah stared at the certificate Catherine Rachel Turner. Finally, a full name, a real identity behind the veil. They arrived in Boston in late September 1895. David continued. James set her up in a separate residence initially. Their marriage was legal protection, not a traditional union. He supported her education, helped her establish her own life. The Brotherhood watched for any sign that Senator Morrison was searching for her, but he never publicly acknowledged her disappearance. To admit she existed would be to admit his wife's defiance. "What happened to Catherine?" Sarah asked, almost afraid of the answer. David smiled, the first genuine smile since Sarah arrived. "That's the beautiful part. And it's a story that deserves to be told carefully." He pulled out one more document, and Sarah's breath caught. It was a photograph dated 1898, showing the same man from the wedding photograph, James Hartwell, standing beside a young black woman whose face was finally, gloriously, visible. Catherine, Rachel Hartwell stared directly at the camera with fierce, intelligent eyes, her expression one of hard-won dignity and unmistakable pride. She had survived. David spread more photographs across the table, each one a window into Catherine's life after the wedding. Sarah studied each image hungrily, finally able to see the woman who had been hidden behind the veil. Catherine had strong, elegant features, high cheekbones, deep-set eyes, and a direct gaze that suggested someone who had survived impossible circumstances and emerged determined. In every photograph, she wore fashionable clothing that would have cost a fortune, but her expression never quite relaxed. Even in freedom, Sarah could see the shadow of fear. James kept his promise. David explained. He set her up in a house in Roxbury, introduced her to Boston society as his wife from Charleston. Some people accepted it, many didn't. But James had enough money and social standing that people couldn't ignore them completely. Sarah found a photograph from 1896, showing Catherine at a desk surrounded by books. She continued her education. She became fluent in French, German, and Italian. She studied literature history, and eventually began teaching other young black women in Boston's community. By 1900, she was running her own small school. David's pride in his ancestor's wife was evident. Elizabeth Morrison had given her the foundation. James gave her protection and resources. But Catherine built her own life through her own determination. Did James and Catherine ever? Were they ever truly married beyond the legal protection? Sarah asked delicately. David shook his head. According to family records, no. They maintained separate residences until James's death in 1910. He never remarried, and he left her half his considerable estate, a fortune that allowed her to expand her school and support dozens of other families escaping the South. And Catherine? Did she ever marry again? David pulled out another photograph, this one from 1912. Catherine stood beside a tall black man in a formal suit, both of them smiling genuinely. She married Dr. Marcus Thompson in 1911, a year after James died. Thompson was a prominent physician in Boston, one of the few black doctors in the city. They were married for 32 years until his death in 1943. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Catherine had gotten her happy ending, not just survival, but a full, rich life. Did she ever go back to South Carolina? Sarah asked. Never. Senator Morrison died in 1904, but Catherine never risked returning. Her mother, Martha, was brought north by the Brotherhood in 1897, and they lived together until Martha's death in 1920. Catherine spent her entire life terrified that someone would discover who she really was, where she came from. David opened a wooden box and removed a small leather journal. This is Catherine's diary from 1895 to 1900. She donated it to the Brotherhood archives before her death in 1962, with specific instructions that it could only be opened after all her children and grandchildren had passed. The last of her descendants died in 2019. This is the first time anyone outside our family has been allowed to read it. He handed it to Sarah carefully. She wanted the truth told. but only when it was safe. When no one could be hurt by Senator Morrison's legacy or the scandal of her escape. She waited a century for her story to be safe. Sarah opened the journal with trembling hands. The first entry was dated September 14, 1895, the wedding day. Today, I married a man I barely know to escape a future I cannot survive. Mrs. Morrison, my teacher, my protector, the closest thing to a mother beyond my own, is gone. The senator plans to erase every trace of her kindness, including me. James Hartwell says he can give me freedom, but I wonder if I will ever truly be free of fear. The photographer asked me to remove my veil for just one portrait, so I might see my own face on my wedding day. I refused. I cannot risk anyone knowing what I look like. Cannot risk the senator finding me. So I will be a bride without a face, a woman without an identity, until I reach safety, if I reach safety. Sarah looked up at David, her vision blurred with tears. She was so afraid. She had every right to be, David said quietly, but she survived. And now, 129 years later, she can finally be seen. While Catherine's story had ended in survival and eventual peace, Sarah discovered that Senator Morrison's search for her had been far more extensive and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Back in Charleston, Sarah met with a local historian named James Crawford, who specialized in the darker aspects of Reconstruction-era politics. When she explained what she had learned about Catherine and Senator Morrison, his expression grew grim. Morrison didn't just let her go, James said, pulling out a box of documents from his personal collection. I've been researching his political career for years, and there are gaps in the records. Destroyed documents, missing correspondences. I always suspected he was hiding something significant. He spread papers across his desk. Private letters Morrison had written to associates, newspaper clippings, and police reports. In October 1895, 1 month after Catherine's escape, Morrison hired private detectives from the Pinkerton Agency. The contract was for recovery of stolen property. His way of describing a human being. James handed Sarah a yellowed report. The Pinkertons searched Charleston, Columbia, Atlanta, and Richmond. They questioned Martha, Catherine's mother, multiple times. According to these reports, Martha claimed her daughter had died suddenly of fever and been buried in a pauper's grave outside the city. Sarah felt a chill. Martha had lied to protect her daughter and paid the price. Look at this. James showed her another document, an arrest record from November 1895. Martha had been charged with providing false information to authorities and spent 3 months in jail. Morrison wanted her punished for helping Catherine escape. The Pinkerton reports continued through 1896, each one documenting dead ends. The detectives traced the Brotherhood's network, but never made the connection to Boston. James Hartwell's name appeared once as a textile merchant from the North, who visited Charleston on business, but he was never investigated further. Morrison was obsessed. James continued, "Look at this letter from 1897. Sarah read Morrison's words written to a political ally. The escaped girl represents more than disobedience. She represents evidence of my late wife's betrayal of our entire social structure. She was educated as a white woman, treated as an equal, given ideas far beyond her station. If her existence becomes known, if she tells her story, it validates everything our opponents claim about the humanity and capability of the Negro race. She must be found and silenced." Sarah felt sick. Catherine hadn't just been fleeing servitude. She had been fleeing elimination. Did he ever find out she went to Boston? Sarah asked. James shook his head. There's no evidence he tracked her there. The Brotherhood was too careful, but Morrison never stopped looking, not until his death in 1904. And even after he died, his sons continued the search sporadically for several more years. He pulled out one final document, A letter from Morrison's oldest son to the Pinkerton Agency, dated 1908, while my father has passed. The family wishes to locate the girl Catherine for closure of certain legal matters regarding property and inheritance from my late grandmother's estate. Any information would be appreciated. Property and inheritance. Sarah read aloud. What property? That's the thing, James said, leaning back in his chair. I did some digging into Elizabeth Morrison's will. She died intestate, without a will, according to official records. But there are references in her personal letters to a trust she established for ensuring certain futures. I think Elizabeth left money for Catherine, and Morrison destroyed the will to prevent her from ever claiming it. Sarah thought about Catherine's diary entries, about her fear and survival. She would never have tried to claim it anyway. It would have revealed where she was. Exactly. Morrison knew that too. By destroying the will, he ensured Catherine would have to choose between her inheritance and her life. He made sure she could never truly be free of him. Sarah looked at the photograph of the veiled bride, understanding now the full weight of that covered face. Catherine hadn't just been hiding her identity. She had been erasing herself to survive. But she won, Sarah said quietly. She lived free. She built a life. She married for love eventually. Morrison died never knowing where she went. James nodded. She won. But the fact that she had to fight so hard, risk so much for basic human dignity, that's the real tragedy. Sarah returned to Columbia to meet with Eleanora Whitfield James one final time, bringing copies of all the documents, photographs, and diary entries she had collected. Eleanora's living room became a temporary archive as they spread Catherine's story across every available surface. I've spent my entire adult life researching my great-great-grandfather's work, Eleanora said, studying the photographs of Catherine with tears in her eyes. I knew he married couples who needed protection, but I never knew the full story of any individual wedding. To finally see her face, to know her name. Sarah handed her Catherine's diary. David Hartwell gave me permission to share this with you. He thought you should know what your ancestor helped make possible. Eleanora reads several passages aloud, her voice thick with emotion. November 1895. I have been in Boston for 2 months now. The cold frightens me almost as much as the senator did. But James has been kind, and I am learning that freedom means choosing my own fear instead of living with his. I miss Mama desperately. The Brotherhood says they are working to bring her north. But I worry the senator is watching her, using her to lure me back. I will not go back. Even if it means never seeing her again, I will not return to that life. March 1896. Today I walked through Boston Common without looking over my shoulder. It was the first time since arriving that I felt like a woman instead of a fugitive. James says I should consider attending lectures at the public library. The idea terrifies and thrills me. Mrs. Morrison would be proud. She always said I had a mind that deserved room to grow. August 1897. Mama arrived yesterday. I did not recognize her at first. She has aged so much in these 2 years, worn on by the senator's cruelty and her own sacrifice. But when she held me, I finally understood that I am truly free. We both are. The senator can never reach us here. Eleanora wiped her eyes. These women, Catherine, Martha Elizabeth Morrison, they fought against an entire system designed to crush them. And they won. Not perfectly, not without cost, Sarah added. But they won. Over the next week, Sarah and Eleanora worked together to compile Catherine's story into a comprehensive historical document. They reached out to David Hartwell in Boston, to James Crawford in Charleston, and to Marcus, who helped connect them with descendants of other couples married by Reverend Whitfield. What emerged was bigger than one woman's story. It was evidence of an entire network of resistance, the Brotherhood of Providence. The ministers who broke the law, the families who protected fugitives, the merchants who provided resources, and the countless individuals who risked everything for love and dignity. Sarah wrote the final draft of her research paper late one night, the veiled wedding photograph propped beside her laptop. She had titled it, Catherine Rachel Turner Hartwell, The Face Behind the Veil. The paper documented everything. Catherine's childhood in the Morrison household, Elizabeth Morrison's defiant kindness, the rescue operation orchestrated by James Hartwell and the Brotherhood, the wedding at Providence Church, Catherine's life in Boston, her school for young black women, her eventual marriage to Dr. Thompson, and her quiet death in 1962 at age 89. But more than facts and dates, Sarah tried to capture something essential. The courage it took for Catherine to step into that church in 1895, to marry a stranger, to trust that the Brotherhood would protect her, to build a new life from nothing. Sarah ended the paper with a quote from Catherine's final diary entry, written in 1900 when she closed the journal for the last time. I have spent 5 years looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows, waiting for the senator's hand to reach north and drag me back. But today, I realized he has no power here. I built a life he cannot touch, created a future he cannot control. The veil I wore on my wedding day was meant to hide me, to protect me by erasing my face. But I don't need it anymore. I am Catherine Rachel Hartwell, teacher, daughter, friend. I am visible. I am free. And I will make sure every girl who comes through my school knows she has the same right to be seen, to be known, to be free. That is my revenge against men like the senator. Not violence or anger, but visibility and education and joy. He wanted to silence me. Instead, I will make noise for the rest of my life. 3 months after completing her research, Sarah stood in a small gallery space at the Charleston Museum, preparing for the opening of a new exhibition, hidden in plain sight, Interracial Love and Resistance in Post-Civil War South Carolina. The centerpiece of the exhibition was the wedding photograph, now professionally conserved and displayed behind museum glass. But beside it, finally, was a second photograph, the 1898 image of Catherine without her veil, her face clear and proud, her identity no longer hidden. Eleanora Whitfield James stood beside Sarah, along with David Hartwell, who had traveled from Boston for the opening. Together they watched as visitors entered the gallery, drawn immediately to the paired photographs. A young woman stopped in front of the display, reading the placard that explained Catherine's story. She was only 22. The woman whispered to her companion, "My age," and she had to marry a stranger just to survive. That was exactly what Sarah had hoped visitors would understand, not just the historical facts, but the human cost. The exhibition included Catherine's diary entries, selected correspondences from James Hartwell and the Brotherhood, Senator Morrison's Pinkerton reports, and photographs documenting Catherine's life in Boston. But it also included something unexpected, records of 17 other couples married by Reverend Whitfield between 1890 and 1899, their stories researched by Marcus and a team of genealogists. Each couple's story was unique, but the pattern was clear. Across the South, in the decades after the Civil War, thousands of people had loved across the color line despite laws designed to prevent it. Some marriages were secret, some were public acts of defiance. Some couples stayed hidden their entire lives, while others fought openly for recognition. David approached the display showing his great-great-grandfather's letters. James never remarried after Catherine's legal protection was secure. He told a small group of visitors who had gathered. He could have, but he told his brother in a letter that having helped one remarkable woman achieve freedom, I have lived a more meaningful life than most men who marry for love. He considered their arrangement his greatest accomplishment. An older black woman in the crowd wiped her eyes. My grandmother used to tell stories about a school in Boston where young black women learned to be teachers. She went there in 1905. She never said who ran it, but she always said the woman who taught there had seen things no one should see and survived with grace. Could that have been Catherine? David nodded. Catherine's school operated from 1900 to 1958. Over 500 women studied there. Your grandmother might have been one of her students. The connection across generations, across time, was exactly what the exhibition was meant to create. As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself back at the wedding photograph, studying the veiled bride one more time. She thought about Catherine standing there in 1895, terrified and brave, choosing freedom over safety, trusting strangers to protect her, stepping into an unknown future with nothing but hope. Eleonora joined her. You gave her face back, she said quietly. For 129 years that veil protected her, but now we can finally see her, remember her, honor her. She gave herself back. Sarah corrected gently. I just told her story. She lived it. A museum docent approached with a message. Bennett, there's someone here asking to speak with you. She says she's Catherine Thompson's great-granddaughter. Sarah's heart leaped. She followed the docent to the gallery entrance, where a woman in her 60s waited nervously. I'm Patricia Thompson, the woman said, extending her hand. My great-grandmother was Catherine Rachel Hartwell. I grew up hearing vague stories about her, but my family never talked about her past. We knew she came from the South, that she escaped something terrible, but she made us promise never to dig into it while she was alive. After she died, her stories faded, until I saw a news article about this exhibition. Patricia pulled a small box from her bag. I brought something. I think it belongs here with her story. Inside the box was a delicate silk veil, yellowed with age but still intact. She kept it, Patricia said, her voice breaking. My great-grandmother kept her wedding veil for 67 years. My mother found it after she died, wrapped in tissue paper with a note. This hid my face when I needed protection. Save it for when hiding is no longer necessary. I think that time is now. Sarah accepted the veil with trembling hands. The curator carefully added it to the exhibition the next day, displayed in its own case with Catherine's note. The veil that once hid Catherine's identity became the exhibition's most powerful artifact. Not because of what it concealed, but because of what its preservation revealed. Catherine had known, even in 1895, that someday her story would be safe to tell. She had waited patiently, survived quietly, and trusted that the future would be kinder than her past. As Sarah locked the museum that evening, she looked one final time at the photographs. The veiled bride and the unveiled woman, separated by 3 years and an immeasurable distance of suffering and survival. Catherine Rachel Turner Hartwell had worn a veil to save her life, but she had kept it to remember that she had once needed saving, and that she had saved herself. Her face was finally visible. Her story was finally told.